Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today we're going to be trying to answer a very important question. What is a good book anyway? So, this video is going to be kind of similar in format to a couple of previous videos I've done. One called What Are Classics Anyway? And one called What is Literary Fiction Anyway? So I'll leave those two videos down below. It might be useful if you haven't seen the one where I talk about literary fiction to watch that before watching this video, because I feel like I will talk about literary fiction and commercial fiction quite a lot in this video, and you will understand what I mean when I use those terms more if you saw that video, but you know, it probably doesn't matter too much. Basically, in those videos and in this video, I'm going to be taking a term that we use quite a lot when talking about books, and kind of trying to dissect it. So here the sort of term is good, which is obviously a very broad term. But today I kind of wanted to talk about, like, what do we mean when we say a book is good? And is there any, like, objective standard for whether or not a book is good? In this video, I am only really going to be talking about novels rather than books more broadly. I'm not going to talk about what makes nonfiction or poetry good. I feel like I don't even know where to start there, to be honest. And I also feel like maybe there are more objective criteria for what makes nonfiction good in terms of, like, rigorous research. But that probably depends on the kind of nonfiction. I don't read enough nonfiction to know what I'm talking about there. Do I even know what I'm talking about when it comes to fiction? I don't know. But anyway, this video will probably be quite rambly. So, what is a good book anyway? Let's start off with a paradox. Fundamentally, I don't think there is any such thing as, like, a good book, like an objectively good book. I believe that reading is completely subjective. What I like in a book is not what other people like in a book, and vice versa. Sometimes someone says a book is fantastic and I read it and I just don't like it at all. And sometimes I read a book that I think is fantastic and someone else reads it and doesn't like it at all. There is no such thing objectively as a good book. Reading is completely subjective. However, I work as an editor. That is my job. That's my trade. That's my profession. I edit books. And sometimes I'm doing copy editing and proofreading and I'm fixing, like, actual technical mistakes, you know, grammar issues, punctuation issues, continuity things, timeline problems. And that kind of editing is less qualitative. There is a qualitative element, like it is about improving the book, but it's much easier to point to a timeline error and say, this just doesn't line up, than it is to point to a character and say they're not well developed enough, if that makes sense. As I said, I partly do copy editing and proofreading, but I also do structural and line edits, and that is part of my job. I've been doing that for years. And when I do that, I am making qualitative edits. I am making edits thinking, what will make this book better? What will improve the plot, the pace, the character arcs, the writing? Especially when I'm line editing, I'm often looking at sentence by sentence. Could this sentence be stronger? Could this sentence work harder? How could this sentence be improved? As an editor, I am working to make books better. So I must believe, and I do believe, that there is such a thing as a good book, or at least that there is such a thing as a better book, because that is my job. And I do believe that my job is useful. And I do believe that when I get a manuscript, I improve it. And I also think it's worth saying that, like, as an editor, you are very aware of the division between your own personal taste and what would improve this book as a whole. And you're quite, like, careful. I'm quite careful to think, am I making this suggestion because it's something I like, or am I making this suggestion because it's something I objectively think would improve the book? I am very careful when I'm editing that any recommendations, any suggestions I make are not just about my own personal taste, but are to do with what I think would really improve the book for a lot of readers. And one thing I notice in my reading for pleasure, you know, reading books that I'm not working on, is that sometimes I read a book and I'm aware that it's just not for me. You know, it's just not my style, or it's not my interest. I didn't gel with the writing style. You know, I recently read The Heart in Winter by Kevin Barry, one of the books on the Walter Scott Prize longlist, and I thought it was really good, but it wasn't really for me. I found the writing style a bit tricky. But I was very aware reading that book that the issue was that it wasn't to my taste, and that was why I didn't like it, rather than that the book wasn't good. But sometimes I read a book and I don't love it, and instead of thinking it's not for me, I think I have notes. Like, as an editor, I have notes. If I had been the editor of this novel, I would have done different things and I would have made different suggestions. I don't think this book lives up to its potential. I have some ideas of how it could have done so. And that's quite a different thing. Like, that's a very different reaction to reading a book. And so I suppose in that sense, when I read a book and I think this just isn't for me, I think this is a good book that I didn't like, but when I read a book and I think I have notes, then that's me thinking this isn't a good book, or at least this isn't as good a book as it could have been. And equally, I think when I read a book and I love it, sometimes I think this book is just fantastic. I would recommend it to nearly everybody. Like when I read Glorious Exploits by Ferdia Ledden earlier this year, I feel like I just thought, this book is just objectively brilliant. Like, I don't know who could read this and think it isn't brilliant. I could kind of see that people wouldn't like it, but like, I just think it's such a good book. But also, sometimes I read a book and I'm more aware of like the reasons why I personally love it. You know, like when you read one of those books and it just feels like it was written for you and it ticks like all of your bookish boxes and it's just so entirely to your taste. And so sometimes I read a book and I'm like, I love this because I love it, but do I love it because it's good? It was interesting, I recently read Hymn to Dionysus by Natasha Pulley. Wonderful book. I really love Natasha Pulley's writing. I love all of her novels, but I was reading some reviews for it on Goodreads, and someone had written in their Goodreads review something along the lines of, I don't know if it's good or if I just love Natasha Pulley, and that kind of made me laugh, because I do think it's a great book, really, really enjoyed it, but also there are so many things I love about Natasha Pulley's writing style. There's something about the way she writes that I find so immersive. I feel like I would just love whatever she writes. And I feel like there are things that I would find too weird or frustrating in another writer's books that Natasha Pulley can pull off for me because I love her books. I don't know, I feel like I've gone off on a tangent here. So let's put all that to the side for a moment, and let's have a think about how we could objectively define a good book. What criteria would we judge a book on? So one thing you might talk about when you talk about whether or not a book is good is the book well written? But, you know, what is good writing anyway? And I definitely do believe that there is such a thing as good writing and bad writing, or at least like better writing and less good writing. I sometimes read things in published books, in unpublished books, whatever, and think that sentence is a bit clunky, that sentence is confusing, that sentence isn't working, the writing style isn't really consistent, you know, this just isn't landing. I think for some people, good writing means literary writing. Lyrical prose with lots of symbolism, probably breaking the rules of punctuation or sentence structure in some way. But I would very much dispute that. Good commercial writing is good writing. I will leave my video down below on literary fiction where I spoke a lot about, you know, literary fiction and commercial fiction. I think sometimes people talk about literary fiction as though it is the only fiction of good quality. But commercial writing is also great writing. It's just doing a different job. The writing style in commercial fiction does tend to be perhaps less lyrical and possibly less complex than in literary fiction. But I often like it a lot more. I often find it a lot more readable, and I often find it a lot more compelling and engaging. In a more plot-driven novel, writing is there to serve a different purpose. It's there to convey plot and characters more than it is to be beautiful in its own right. I know I said this in my video about literary fiction ages ago, but if you are reading a very literary fiction novel, a ponderous, meanderous, beautiful thing, and you stop to think about how beautiful a sentence is, then that's great. But if you're reading a very commercial plot-driven novel and you stop to think about how beautiful a sentence is in the middle of an action scene, then it's kind of taking you out of the action. So, you know, what makes writing good depends on the context and the genre and what the writing is trying to do. But also it is quite subjective depending on the reader. One person might think a book is superbly written that I find really overwrought. I think I generally value precision and clarity in writing more than I value beauty, but that's not what everyone values, and it's perfectly valid to value different things in writing. Another way you might judge a book would be on the characterization. I feel like we're in slightly firmer ground here. Like, I feel like, are the characters well created, interestingly drawn, psychologically real? You know, I feel like most people value interestingly drawn characters in their books. And obviously this is still very subjective. Like, you know, I always find it interesting when I read kind of Goodreads reviews of books I've read. You can have two reviews for the same novel, one of which says the characterization is amazing and one of which says it's terrible. I have read books that I thought had great character arcs in, and then looked at the Goodreads reviews after I finished reading it, and several people were like, there was no character development. I thought the characters were so poorly drawn. And I'm there thinking, did we read the same book? So characterization and how you judge it is subjective. But I do, in general, think a kind of fully created character is generally something that makes a good book. Definitely as an editor, like when I look at characters, I'm thinking, is this character's behavior consistent, or at least like led up to? Do we feel we get to know them? Like, do they have an arc? Is their arc smooth? Or like, are there clear trigger points for when they change? Are their reactions believable? Do we see enough of them to care about them? But even when I think about those kind of questions that I like ask when I'm like interrogating a manuscript, it is a bit wishy-washy, right? Editing is based on like instinct and experience and knowledge that you have from reading a lot of books, and other things too, and genre and context and many other things. But like, a lot of it is instinct and experience. As an editor, like when I recommend a specific change, I can always explain why I'm recommending like that specific change. But to like discuss generally more how I judge a book when I'm editing feels much more nebulous. And also, having said that a fully created character is generally something that would make a good book, or that would be important when you are judging whether or not a book is good, that isn't necessarily always true. Sometimes characters are intentionally shallow or exaggerated. You know, think about Dickens's characters, not all of them are psychologically real, and that is kind of the point. And it works, and that's fine. Some of those characters are not there to be real people, they are there to serve other purposes. And there are lots of other ways in which characterization can be subjective. You know, there's a lot of division about whether characters should be relatable or likable, or the complete opposite. You know, a lot of people like reading about the really horrible people, and a lot of people don't. I suppose the real like fundamental when it comes to characterization and what about characterization makes a book good is, are the characters interesting? And maybe do they have a character arc, or if they don't, is there a clear reason why they don't? But you know, the question, are the characters interesting, is also subjective depending on what you find interesting. Another thing you might judge a book on is its plot, and its pace perhaps kind of ties in with this, but how much plot matters kind of varies between genres. The more commercial a novel is, the more the plot is important. The more literary, potentially the less important the plot is. Often the premise is kind of more important than the plot when it comes to literary fiction. Some novels suit a slow pace, some novels suit a fast pace. Usually I would say a good novel tends to have a pace that ramps up, but that's not always true. You know, I feel like as an editor, when I'm reading a book that isn't paced as it should be to serve the plot correctly, I am very aware of that. But what makes a good plot is very subjective depending on the reader and also on the genre and kind of where this book fits. Another category you might look at is kind of themes. And here I feel like slightly on firmer ground again. You know, does a novel ask any interesting questions or look at any interesting things? Does it explore its themes in a consistent, interesting way? Like so often, a fault I find with books that I do find to be a genuine fault is when a theme is like set up and then just like slips away and is never really looked at again. But again, like how well the themes are drawn is probably quite subjective, and also how important the themes are might vary. I think sometimes we think of themes as being more important in literary fiction than commercial. I don't necessarily think that's true. I think really good commercial fiction does look at its themes in a really complex and interesting way, although like chiefly via the medium of plot and character. So my kind of like main instinct when thinking about how do you judge whether or not a book is good would be those kind of four things: writing, characters, plot, and themes. But there are a lot of other things that might make a difference in a book and that might matter more for some books than others. So one thing I kind of thought of was like world building and atmosphere. I think especially in works of sort of science fiction, fantasy, historical fiction, world building is very, very important. And there's lots of other genres where it might be really important too. Atmosphere is probably also very important for those novels, and also for kind of like thrillers or crime, anything that's meant to be really tense, anything that's gothic. But then you wouldn't really judge like a rom-com necessarily on its world building or its atmosphere, but you might judge it on its like vibe. I can't really think of like a better word, but I do feel like rom-coms have an atmosphere, but atmosphere doesn't feel like the right word. But again, it is subjective and it does depend on the book, because while for the most part I would say that like a well-rounded, fully fleshed out world in terms of the world building is stronger, I can also think of books like Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro, where the world building is very thin, which isn't to say that the world building isn't there, and I think probably Ishiguro like knows everything in his head, but what we get on the page about the world that the characters are in, it's a science fiction novel, is quite limited, but we kind of know like just enough and it really works. But I feel like in other novels it wouldn't necessarily work, and maybe that wouldn't work for all readers. I do feel like that was one problem that quite a lot of people have with Clara and the Sun is that they wanted to know more about the world. Basically, this video is just a long way of me saying it's subjective for a really long time. Anyway, another kind of thing I was thinking about was like engagement. Both kind of like emotional engagement and like excitement engagement, I suppose. You know, are you rushing through this book, desperate to know what happens? Are you really like emotionally invested in the book? I feel like a lot of what I've been saying comes down to the kind of question, is this book interesting? Is this book fun and or emotionally affecting and or thought-provoking? I don't think it needs to be all three. I don't think it needs to be fun and emotionally affecting and thought-provoking, but it probably needs to be at least one. I was trying to think if I feel like the books that I love the most are all three of those things, such as Glorious Exploits by Ferdinand Lennon. That is definitely fun and emotionally affecting and thought-provoking. But I don't think all books that are great need to be all of those things. I think a book can be hugely fun but not thought-provoking and still be a great book. And vice versa. I think some people would probably place a higher value on thought-provoking than fun, but I personally wouldn't. But again, these things are also subjective. So basically, I think all the things we've been talking about are not that helpful in terms of measuring whether or not a book is good. They probably do all come into it, and they probably impact how much you like a book, with some aspects having like more impact for some people than others. But I also think they're not really things that are objective and that can be measured. Again, everything is very subjective, which means there's kind of no such thing as a good book. But again, we return to my paradox. Like, one, I just do believe that some books are better than others. I think I do think that. But also, as an editor, I do think that books can be made better. And if I think the books can be made better, I must believe that there is some kind of thing we're aspiring towards, some kind of good book that we're aiming to get to, right? So before I move on to like the kind of conclusion-y stuff that I do have to say, because I find this such an interesting topic, I thought it'd be interesting to kind of ask people what they thought. So I put a question on the community page on YouTube and had lots of really interesting responses. There are still responses coming in when I'm filming this. Like, I just like added something to my notes like 5 minutes before starting filming this video. So I'm sorry, there's probably lots of really interesting responses that I haven't like mentioned here. Do go and look at the comments, the replies to that thread on the community page, because I thought it was really, really interesting. One thing that quite a few people mentioned that I haven't really spoken about at all so far is like uniqueness and originality. You know, whether or not a book has like a distinct voice, whether or not it's doing something different. I don't think a good book has to be wholly original, but I suppose like a really, really fantastic book, like more than just a good book, but like a really standout book, is probably doing something different. But not necessarily. Sometimes a book is just really fantastic at what it's doing, and what it's doing might not be like the newest thing ever, but it's just like a really fantastic example of doing that thing. But the reason why it's so fantastic is probably because there's something new about it. So maybe I agree with that, I don't know. A lot of people spoke about the fact that a book has to have great writing, the story has to be well told, but these things are so hard to judge, aren't they? A lot of people spoke about characters, and less about kind of like fully rounded or fleshed out characters, and more about like characters that are compelling, characters we care about and that stay with us. Someone said, great books make me care about characters and what will happen to them. And this kind of came up a lot in kind of different people's answers, which I think is a really good point. Like, it's not just that the characters have to be interesting and fully developed, but they have to be characters you care about, which doesn't mean you have to like them. I don't think that's the same thing, but I do think that nearly all the books I can think of that I think are good, I do care about the characters, or like I'm invested in the characters, I suppose. A lot of people spoke about engagement, kind of both in terms of enjoyability and also terms of emotion, whether the book is a page turner or you're just like really emotionally invested. These things are important. If you care about the story and you care about the characters, that makes such a difference as you read. A book could have beautiful, technically great writing. I mean, what is technically great writing anyway? It doesn't matter. But if it's not interesting to you, if you're not engaged in it, then is it good? Not really. Jennifer Loves Books said, a sign of a good book is when I just can't put it down, which I definitely agree with. And quite a few other people talked about, you know, whether or not a book is a page turner. Someone else said, a good book plunges me inside it, I live in it, which I thought was also a really nice way of describing it. Like, when you are loving a book and you are really, really invested in it, like that kind of immersion is important. A few people talked about staying power, which is something else I haven't really touched on in this video. You know, a book that you keep loving after you've read it, that you want to reread potentially. That definitely can be quite an important thing, and I definitely feel like there are some books that I read and I really enjoy them when I read them, but then I'm not really thinking about them later, whereas there are other books which I think about a long time afterwards. Jim from Jim's Books, Reading and Stuff left a really interesting comment. He said, a good novel tends to hit a few key notes, even if that melody sounds different every time. Compelling characters, vivid, immersive world, a strong voice, themes that resonate, narrative momentum or purpose, and that intangible feeling, which I definitely think is a really good way of explaining like why a book has to be good. All of the things that you would think make a good book and something else that is random, and we can't really explain it. It's also a nice way to think about it, like, there are a few keynotes, but there might be a different way of doing it. You know, some books that are really good have some elements more than others because different books have different like requirements. Another really interesting comment I had spoke about like people using great and good to mean highly acclaimed. And the fact that those two things are not the same thing. A book doesn't have to speak to the human condition to be a great book, which I really, really agree with. I feel like some people think that to be good, a book has to like say something really meaningful about humanity. But I don't think it has to if that's not what it's trying to do. And, you know, I think a lot of this stuff is very subjective because it depends on what you're reading for. I am primarily reading for fun. And I am also reading to learn. I do learn a lot from novels. I am also reading to, like, broaden my horizons and be made to think about things. But, like, the main reason I read is because I find reading really, really fun. And so I don't think a book needs to tell me something, like, deep and meaningful for it to be a good book. There's that one point, but then the other point I think kind of related to that is that I think some people think that only literary fiction tells you something deep and meaningful, and I just like, I've said this before, but I just think I have learned more about the human condition from reading Emily Henry books than I have from reading Will Self. I'll read out one other comment I had because this is quite useful for kind of leading into what I'm going to talk about next, and that was from Shari Burke, who said, I always consider what kind of book it is, which is tied up with my expectations. I'm very much a mood reader, so if I pick up a cozy mystery, I have different expectations than if I'm gravitating towards a classic or a work of literary fiction. And I feel like expectation and like what kind of book it is quite important when it comes to judging whether or not a book is good. So that kind of leads me on nicely to the final thing I want to talk about today, which I think kind of gets to the bottom of that paradox of I believe reading is subjective. I don't really believe there's such a thing as a good book, but I am an editor, so I do think books can be improved. I don't necessarily think there's such a thing as a good book, but I do think there is such a thing as like making a book better. And I do think there are books that don't live up to their potential. One thing I keep coming back to as I think about this like topic is a phrase that I use in editing like quite a lot, and that is something along the lines of like, make this novel as brilliant as it can be, make this book the best version of itself, something like that, which sounds a bit cheesy now I've said it out loud. But like as an editor, part of your job is to like work out what the author is trying to do and help them achieve that. And I think that is kind of one of the most important like things to think about in terms of judging whether or not a book is good. Does it achieve what it sets out to do? And as an editor, that is like one of the big parts of your job, is to make sure the book lives up to its potential, is the best version of itself it can be, is as good a book as it can be, but still the same book. Like I think some people think that like editing must be quite fraught, and definitely like as an author I sometimes have people ask me, is it really hard being edited because the editor wants to change things? But like the editor doesn't want to change your book. One of my like absolute favourite ever mentions in an author's acknowledgements is from CJ Cook's novel The Ghostwoods, which I edited, and in the acknowledgement she thanked me for my literary midwifery, which was thematically appropriate to the book, which is partly set in a mother and baby home, but I also thought that was a really like nice way of thinking about editing and quite a useful way of framing editing. Like, the editor is not there to change your book. The editor's kind of there to like make sure the book gets safely from your mind to the page. Like a good editor doesn't want to completely change what your book is. A good editor wants to make your book the best version of itself, the strongest book it can be while remaining the book it is. And I feel like a lot of the stuff that is hard about being an editor, but is also really fun about being an editor, is like seeing what the author is trying to do and ensuring they can do it. Coming back to what I was saying about themes earlier, you know, one thing I think often when I'm editing is that I can see that there is a theme running through the book, but it hasn't been pulled out enough. And then as an editor, you're saying, well, maybe we need to bring in more of this theme here. How can we weave this thread throughout the book? How can we pull out this element of the book and make it stronger? Because it's part of the book, it's obviously important, but it's not quite coming to the fore enough. And so by that metric, which for me is kind of like the main metric as an editor and probably as a reader, a good book is a book that achieves what it sets out to do, where the author has succeeded in doing what they wanted to do. And obviously that's not like a perfect way of saying what a good book is, because a writer could aim to write a boring book. And if they succeeded, it would be a boring book. And they would have succeeded in their intention, but would it be good? Not really. And obviously, you know, a writer might have the intention of writing a book with a purpose of like spreading hate or discrimination, and I would not call that a good book. So, you know, I don't think it's like a perfect metric. But I do think broadly, like thinking about what is this book trying to do? Does it live up to its potential? Is quite a useful way for me to think about like whether or not a book is good or not. And I think that has to be tempered with a lot of the other things we've spoken about, especially in terms of like engagement and whether or not a book is interesting. But then again, like I feel like pretty much all authors do intend their book to be interesting and engaging. Whatever else you might intend your book to do, I feel like most people do intend their books to be interesting. But I do feel like whether or not a book achieves what it sets out to do is quite a good way of like judging whether or not a book is good and judging whether or not a book has been effective. As I said right at the beginning, however long ago that was, sometimes I read books and I think this wasn't for me. And those are usually books that I think have probably done what they're trying to do well, but I just wasn't a fan of what they were trying to do. But sometimes I read books and I think, as an editor, I have notes. As an editor, I would have done something differently if I had been working on this book. And those books, I think, are often books that aren't living up to their potential. And often books that aren't quite achieving what they set out to do. There's probably also some subjectivity in there from me, no doubt. You can't really just turn off your subjectivity, can you? But I do think I sometimes read books and think subjectively I don't like this, and I sometimes read books and I think objectively this doesn't work. And obviously my objectively is a subjective thought, but you know, this has just gone down a rabbit hole, hasn't it? I will finish off this video by reading out one final reply to my community post from Ben Reads Good, who cleverly foresaw the entire conclusion of this video. He said, "I think it's all about execution of intent. A good book, in my opinion, is one in which the author achieves what they have set out to do." And I completely agree. That is also my opinion. So there we go. I can't really say it better than that. So yes, I feel like this has been quite a rambly video, but hopefully it has been interesting and useful. I would be very interested to know what you think makes a good book, and whether when you read, you think about subjectivity and objectivity, and whether you're judging a book by like different criteria. This is something I think about quite a lot, because I feel like I'm usually quite careful on my channel to be like, this is my favourite book, this is a book that I love, rather than this is the best book. And I'm always surprised, like sometimes I say this is my favourite author and people are like, why is Charles Dickens your favourite author? He's not the best author. And I'm like, well, but he doesn't need to be the best. He is my favourite. That's not the same as being the best. I mean, obviously he's the best, but I also know that he's probably not. I know some of those books have flaws, but do I get the same enjoyment from much else that I get from reading Dickens? No. Enjoyment and engagement are very, very important, and I think Dickens does, in most of his books, achieve what he sets out to do. Final tangent over. Thank you very much for watching this rambly video. Do let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video. Okay, I know I just finished this video and the video was so done that I like took off my fun bookish cardigan because I was quite warm by the end of filming that. But I've come back briefly because I just got another reply to my community post from the Walter Scott Prize, by which I mean the Walter Scott Prize, like PR people. But I feel like as a literary prize reply to my post, I should probably share with you what they said. And they said, the Walter Scott Prize judging criteria are originality, innovation, ambition, durability, and quality of writing, which I thought was very, very interesting to see like what they judge based on in their prize, like what they're thinking about. And I do kind of get that for a book prize, like originality probably matters more than just like whether or not a book is good. And ambition's quite an interesting one. You know, I've just said a good book is a book that achieves what it sets out to do. But I feel like for the Walter Scott Prize, a book they want to longlist is a book that not only achieves what it sets out to do, but a book that sets out to do something really, really interesting. And maybe that's the difference between a good book and a great book. I don't know. I just wanted to come back very briefly with that final point because I thought that was quite interesting. Kind of feel like I should have posted that community post like a week before I did. Basically, please go and read all the replies to that community post as well because it's very interesting. That's all. I'm actually going now. I promise. Goodbye.